Welcome to Growth for Good, the show about amplifying impact for nonprofits, charities, and social purpose businesses. I'm Daniel Francavilla, a marketing advisor and brand strategist and your host. On this show, I interview leaders at nonprofits and social enterprises and the organizations that support them. We discuss the wins, challenges, and best practices when it comes to communications, marketing, fundraising, and impact. Let's dive into today's episode. All right, so Zahra, welcome to Growth for Good. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me. I can't believe I'm here.
Yes, you're here finally. So we're going to start off. I know you do a lot of different amazing things. We're going to start off with you giving a quick 30-second elevator pitch for your company, Monumental.
Great. 30 seconds. Okay, here we go. Monumental is a social purpose business that helps city building organizations. So that includes civil society organizations and nonprofits, municipalities, and developers, help create more community-informed strategies to do their work. So to go beyond community engagement, which is meaningful and important, but get to sort of the higher order work that we need to do, which is understand how to bring to life this concept of what does it mean to share power with communities? What does it mean to share resources with communities? What does it mean to design shared decision-making models where we don't have to engage people one time, but we make decisions together over the long term? How do we embed equity in our work? And so our organization works with a variety of actors, and we build bridges. And it's a really unusual role to play, but someone needs to do it.
And did this come about during the pandemic, where you kind of launched this, or did you have the idea before?
Many stories. It depends on who you ask. So I was running an organization, and my co-founder, Kofi Hope, was also running an organization for many, many years, and we both left at exactly the same time. We both left in June 2018. And having worked together on a project that should have gone completely sideways and off a cliff, and that we saved together years ago with the help of many bright, smart, wonderful people, we earmarked that we'd wanted to work together again. In 2018, we started practicing. We started practicing what does it mean like for two change makers to come together who have a profile and a brand to come together and co-lead something. So we began the process of professional dating. What does it mean to bring our professional practices and our brands together? In the post-George Floyd moment, when the world's consciousness finally was arriving at the place where so many of us have been for a very long time, and institutional consciousness was waking up, Kofi began writing for the Toronto Star and wrote an article about, how organizations need to think in more dynamic ways about anti-racism work.
I remember that article being shared, yeah.
And if you remember that article being shared, you remember the faded tweet where I decided on a random June afternoon, in a few months into the lockdown, to say, myself and Kofi Hope are starting a company, and it's exactly all the things he says in this article that are the reasons why. And within 7 days, we had enough work and opportunity to keep us busy to the end of the year. I had noodled around the name Monumental a couple of years ago over a drink in Chicago with my partner, saying, when the time is right, Monumental is going to be the name of my next organization. I'm notoriously the worst namer in the world. So this was a real, maybe my one and only naming win. And so it came about in response to the moment that the world was that was happening in the world. But it came as a result of sort of a long-standing trust that had been cultivating over a decade. And the time was right, and the market was right. I think you'll remember me saying years ago, it's hard to find a budget line for the kind of work I do or want to do. And all of a sudden, the budget line started to appear. And we were ready, right? Emergence is where momentum meets opportunity, is what a mentor of mine says. And so we've been building the momentum, and the opportunity emerged, and Monumental, it was an opportunity for Monumental, and everything else is the emergence, right? So
amazing. It's so great to hear the origin story of it. I love the branding and the colors and all that as well. So it makes sense. It all came together perfectly.
Yeah.
And so it's been, I guess, 2-3 years since you've been running this practice. Amazing. All the guests on this show are very passionate about what they do. Outside of your client work, although I'm sure you're very passionate about your client work, what are some of the issues that are most important to you?
Well, it's interesting because it starts in Monumental and grows, right? So in this conversation, I guess, or in this context where Kofi and I both also, I think we're mid-career. I think that's what you could call us. That's what we're going to call us. I don't know if we're middle-aged, if we're mid-career, that's for sure. And so there's sort of two things happening with Monumental. One is a chance to respond to the moment, which is everything you just heard. And then there's another sort of half of what we do, which is creating the future, right? And creating the future is self-initiated projects that we want to see happen because we've seen the cycles happen. There's no consulting project, no institution that's going to come to us saying that we want to solve this problem. Right. We've learned, and that's okay. And so as creatives, as designers, as innovators, as, social change makers, intentional people, a huge part of our practice is stepping into creating the future we want to see. And so right now on the Monumental side, and you'll hear more about it on February 7th, 2023, when our report launches, a huge focus we've seen is that cities are our homeroom for our work. They are driven in large part. Their economic outcomes are driven largely by development, real estate development. And it's an industry that's predominantly non-racialized people. And so we did some research last year that launches in a couple weeks, but we're being supported by an institute of the federal government to launch an incubator program to build a cohort of mid-career folks who want to get into real estate development, who can also speak into the emerging opportunities that are happening because legislation is changing around how we build in cities. There's a massive economic opportunity emerging with great partners like our federal housing agency, CMHC, and a whole bunch of other folks. We actually have the opportunity to create a cohort of developers who can build the city we want to see. So that's very close to my heart right now.
Yeah.
I think on the other side, unsurprisingly, there is a focus on being aggressively more intentional with an equity lens on my own work. I think none of us are exempt from this kind of self-reflection. And so a project of mine this year, and I've been using sort of the creative side of who I am to explore this, is someone said to me over the last year, to decolonize your practice, you need to expand the aperture of who you think community is. Right? You need to think about all beings more than human kinfolk. You need to think about nature. You need to think about the energy of the beings in the world. And how do you meaningfully liaise with all of them and recognize from a more indigenous worldview who else needs to be involved in decision making. So that's become something, I'm learning, but I'm finding a lot of connection and creativity and expansion in that learning. So.
Amazing. And I love how all of the work intersects, but what's really unique about your practice is that, if the client doesn't come, you kind of work on it on your own, right?
Totally.
And you kind of start thinking of these solutions. And eventually it sounds like there will be an alignment where maybe a funder will come into the play or partners will exist. Totally. And you're already there because you're ready. You've been thinking about it, right?
Emergence, right?
I love that. So you've worn multiple hats concurrently over the years, including now.
Yeah.
And I know that from your one of your TEDx talks, because you've done a couple, you talked about the age of the professional title is over. So a couple of questions there. I wanted to know what role has you as a person, you being the one consistent element that ties all these initiatives together. How has your own personal identity and your brand played towards supporting these various initiatives or drawing more attention to them, you could say perhaps. And then lastly, for someone who's early in their career, a question I often get is, how do I build my personal brand? And, you're an amazing case study of someone who's, aligned yourself and affiliated yourself with so many diverse different initiatives. I'd love to know, maybe we can start with the first question, which is, what role your personal brand and network plays in the success of your work?
We must have met when I was 25, right? I was an accidental prof at OCADU. And, that was the nucleus. It was almost very much an embodiment of who I would become, right? An accidental prof who didn't know how to do something, but really took the opportunity seriously and wanted to get it right and promised to do it right. And right sort of by my own standard, to be honest, which is what I thought at the time, given my, the limited maybe worldview I had and the lived experience I had that I would want when I was in the classroom. I think I guess brand is a funny thing to talk about now, and like, you know, in the company of someone like you who thinks about it all the time. I think I self-identify as an introvert. People don't believe it, but I am. I like to go where the crowd isn't. So, you know, wherever the hype is, wherever there's critical mass, I'm kind of looking to like, oh, what's in the other rooms? And that's kind of been the history of my career. And so, you know, specifically in my experience doing like participatory design, you know, I did a lot of work based in community. That space started to grow. A lot of actors started to join that space.
Right.
And it was people who were as good, if not better than me at it, like doing excellent, tremendous work. So naturally I was like, well, what's not working here? Who's not here? Let me go find them. So then I like kind of was like, wait, the corporate sector's not here. They don't know how to show. I'm gonna go talk to that. I'm gonna go into that room. And so, you know, my sister always talks about following your questions, and I think that's really been the way I've built my brand. It's like, what are the questions determining sort of how I spend my time? It doesn't mean that, you know, you can distinguish between your work and your job, right? And so my life's work is really about shifting power, but there's sub-questions to that. And underneath that, different jobs or opportunities or initiatives help me activate those questions. So I might not need to, you know, I can answer some questions from a volunteer role. I can answer some questions in academia in my role as professor. I can answer some of those questions through client work, through my creative practice, and I think I'm constantly just looking for that. I think rolling that up into a brand, I think if you know, whenever I put things out into the world, they're invitational, right? Even the TED Talk you mentioned, I don't think I ever speak with certainty about my position. I speak to offer an invitation to say yes and tell me. I want people to say, tell me more. And what I noticed in my professional journeys, as people try and I've watched other people sort of explore their own questions and notice them undermining themselves, right? Having tons to say about a certain space. You know, I met you when you were in school. You had tons to say about comms and branding, but you were just a student, right? And it just kept, you know, viscerally feeling not right, that there was a lot of people with deep wisdom and knowledge, but because they didn't have the title, they weren't granted the opportunity to participate.
Right.
And similarly, you speak, you know, you work, I'd spent my formative years in working with equity-deserving communities, and they had a lot to say about their built environment, but they didn't wear the title of architect or planner, so they didn't get to play that role in determining their future. So I think I just became skeptical. I think we need credentials. I think credentials are really important as it pertains to like so many professions, as we've seen over the last 2.5 years. We have a vaccine because of credentialed professionals. I think it's a yes and, which is where do we absolutely need this, and where is it just convention drives behavior? And that's where I'm sort of trying to poke holes all the time.
Got it. That makes sense. And I love that. I love that whole concept of how you kind of move to where where the crowd isn't, where you can discover opportunities and ask the right questions. And that's, you know, you have one of your many lenses is the academia, which is to ask those questions, but you can also do that as like a strategist, for example, or as a consultant, where your job is to ask the questions and bring that viewpoint that maybe the existing institution or organization isn't seeing, right? So that's where that value lies. But I love that all of like the lens of all of it ties everything together from the perspective of, again, like equity, city building, design, like that's kind of that whole realm that you formed. So I guess what you're saying from your story is that you didn't set out to like combine all these worlds, but if you look at it in retrospect, this is your personal brand kind of sums those things together. Would you agree?
Yeah, and you know, like I think, you know, multi-hyphenate before multi-hyphenate, right? Like, and like now trying to take it back a little bit, but I think, you know, what did you say? Equity, design. What did you say? Equity, design, and cities.
Yes.
Right? So if you break that down, it's like the why, the how, the what, right? So I started with my why, which was doing work in community, which was like, oh yeah, these folks, these communities are not typically engaged in this thing that really determines their health, their wellness, their ability to thrive, access, economic opportunity, community, all those kinds of things. That was equity. So what are we going to do? We're going to make cities better. How are we going to do it? With the tool I have, and, you know, combined with the collective skills of many, I'm going to bring this lens of human-centeredness, of design, and see what it does. So it ended up by sort of pursuing this set of like, well, why don't we do it this way? Pushing on orthodoxies. I ended up getting to my continuum of my why, how, what.
Right.
And it, again, in retrospect, seems very tidy, but sometimes I find that the conventional brand building can also limit our capacity to dream for ourselves of like what intersections can actually make us whole, right? Or can make us, can make a life, can make a profession, can make an identity. So
Because you don't necessarily know, right, until you make those connections.
So I think our limiting beliefs can do a lot to sort of
Got it.
really in all parts of our lives. And I think we talk about it a lot in our personal lives, but I think in professional lives, limiting beliefs about who we are and who we can be and what worlds intersect are similar to credentials, where it's like, you can't be an artist strategist. Well, who says you can't be an artist strategist? Like, who said that? Who actually said no? And that's where it's like expanding the notion of what a credential is and what we value.
And I think it's the intersection. Like those intersections are where that amazing work happens. So when I applied, as a high school student who is so much into activism, and this that I started a nonprofit when I was in high school, I looked at I applied to all different programs at all different schools. I applied to the nonprofit program at Dalhousie, right? In Halifax. I applied to communications programs, design programs, business programs, right? Like I didn't know what pathway I would need to take, but I learned quickly that design is a vehicle that could encompass any initiative or interest or passion, right? Yeah. And then being in your think tank class that open the box of okay, wow, it literally is the vehicle. Like design is the method to get involved in all these community initiatives. And so I think your career is an amazing story for people to look through. And I love how you've been able to bridge those gaps between corporate, government, arts. Anyways, that being said, those are all there's a lot of complexities in those environments. So I'd love to know if there's one or two maybe challenges or, kind of projects that, were roadblocks or ones that maybe you continue to battle in your career.
Well, I mean, the tension between fierce incrementalism and radical change is an evergreen tension in, you see an opportunity for radical change and then realize that fierce incrementalism is still extremely difficult, and anyone who's early career or working within an organization can attest.
Right.
It's tremendously difficult, and it's not smaller work, and it's meaningful work. But the tension between how do we open the opportunities for more radical change? And we've seen it happen, right? The lockdowns and, 2020 to 2022, as my friend Adam always has been saying, it's what was said to be impossible was made possible. So you start to see, I think it's in that way there was some hope in that, where it's all the things people said weren't possible, could be enabled very quickly, because all of a sudden, and this is the reality of a lot of things, when problems become the problems of the middle class, they become real.
Everyone pays attention.
Right?
Right.
Folks want to go to museums. They can't go to museums. Okay, we'll put museums online. But when folks who experienced accessibility issues wrote to museums, and this was my friend Adam, who's an accessibility advocate, he talks about how, we've been asking museums for a long time, please put your collections online. We'd like to visit virtually. I have mobility issues, or whatever the case it is. And then, so it's also, so that's a tension, right? And then maybe emerging from that, just that piece around, this social purpose at the kids' table, at the CSR table, and at the adjacent to the adults' table of here's where the business happens, and the decision making happens, and that applies to all organizations, of all kinds. It's not just corporate organizations. I think that remains the tension where some attention was paid. Everyone looked over at the kids' table for and was like, wait a second, it's way more rich over there. It's interesting, it's dynamic. So much is happening that could change the world. And so I do think there's this tension because equity is almost remains a nice to have. We had a moment where it was an imperative, but that is shifting again. And it's not to say it's lost its urgency, but the investment's falling out from under it. And that's what's, there was a moment where our liberation is bound, and we know that serving someone from an equity-deserving community, very different from the person you typically serve, rising tide lifts all boats. But that's shifting. And so how do we sort of institutionalize this idea that, our liberation is bound, like Lila Watson says, right? That beautiful Indigenous artist. And I think that remains, I hope that's not, perennial, but for the moment it remains a tension.
Makes sense. Absolutely. That's a great, I think, a challenge that a lot of organizations and people at different levels can all relate to and see. And like I said, I love that there was that shift that happened, but it's a matter of like what parts of that thinking can be sustained and continue, right? And some were fundamental. Earlier guests have talked about things like funding cycles, like grants that opened up specifically because of the pandemic, specifically because of the equity issues that were brought to the forefront. Yeah. And so now all this funding was available. But now we're starting to see that that's also shifting back to quote unquote normal, right? And so we need to find ways to keep the focus on the priority areas, right?
Yeah, and that's where sort of the notion of, I think there's phases of a career, right? And I think that's important to remember, that sometimes you're in a phase of radical change and maybe that's, as an entrepreneur within an organization, and maybe there's, fierce incrementalism when you're an entrepreneur trying to pay your rent. Like, and it's, those kinds of things are seasonal. And I think, if there are early career entrepreneurs listening, I think that's okay, right? Just because you're working in the space of fierce incrementalism at the moment doesn't mean you're not radical. And I think it's also, and I remember this. I remember going to the private sector and people said it was the death of my career. But really to me, it made so much sense to depart from the systems I knew and step into a system I didn't, because I was seeing its impact on cities and the communities that I cared about.
Right.
And gave me a literacy that in part is what is one aspect of monumental success. There's many aspects of monumental success, but it's one, is that sort of literacy around how to navigate large organizations and their bureaucracies and do things in a way that are good for our mental health and well-being too, allow us to do great work and take care of ourselves in the process. Mm-hmm. So I would also say that like your questions can also take you to places that you wouldn't expect. And I think that's where, Audre Lorde talks a lot about how we removed intuition from professionalism. And that was an act, of, some kind of supremacy. And I think it's, time to really think about where that sort of intuition and gut check plays a role in helping us pursue the answers to our questions.
I love that. And I think with some of the ways that hiring has changed, even just the way certain job descriptions are worded nowadays within certain organizations, it looks like, some organizations are more open-minded to different ways of thinking, different approaches. Even when it comes to curriculums and programs, like I saw some postings where education institutions are saying, like, we want you to tell us what the needs are, right? Like, we're not going to tell you what to teach or what content. Like, we are looking for the needs, for you to tell us the needs, right? And so I think that there are some positive shifts in that direction as well. It's not just all coming from the top down from, traditional institution lens.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are those opportunities. I wanted to know if there was any specific wins that you wanted to share. I know, like in our sector, especially in the nonprofit social good space, a lot of times we're like, pointing out the problems, right?
Yeah.
Trying to show people what's wrong, trying to show people that they need to take action and help or donate or support or volunteer. Are there any wins from any of the organizations you've been a part of, or any projects that you consider a success that you'd like to share over the last few years?
I mean, yeah, I feel really blessed. There's a lot. The top line is when we started Monumental, we had a dream that, the traditional landscape of urbanism and urban development was so predominantly dominated by men and non-racialized men. And, part of my brand, I think, and this is me saying it, is that, like, I was unexpected when I sort of joined the conversation or invited myself to the conversation on urbanism, and gave myself permission to take some space.
Right.
And that in part was part of my brand. I think there, part of what we wanted in Monumental was a team of people who were barriered from experiences for a variety of reasons. Smart, engaged, dynamic, great leaders. Mm-hmm. To have the opportunity to work on the problems like of our moment with the institutions that had power to make change.
Right.
And when you talk about brand, part of the opportunity with Monumental is bringing my brand together with the brand of my co-founder, Kofi Hope, to see how much opportunity we could unlock. And we have unlocked a lot. It could be stage of career, it could be brand, it's probably the alchemy of all those things. But I think one of the points of pride that we have is that we found this space to bridge, being an organization that does consulting work and being, an innovator in and of ourselves and being a community.
Right.
And we take very good care of the people that we work with, if you work with us for a week or you work with us forever. And so we have this mantra, advancing a fair and just world, raising others up as we rise. And I think that's been sort of traditionally the story of leadership is one leader rises. It's our choice of being co-leaders. It's our choice of raising up, other racialized or, intersectional leaders so that they have opportunities as we get opportunities.
Right.
And we're doing our best. I think we're doing an okay job. And I'm really proud of that. I'm proud of the culture of the organization we built and the values, even though we're entrepreneurs in our third year. So that feels like, a big win.
I love that. That's huge. And it's something that, you can own because it's your organization and, you've helped to not help, but you've co-built this.
Yeah.
So that's exciting. So when we'll kind of switch gears to a little bit on the, public facing side when it comes to, communications, social media, how you put things out there into the world. I wanted to know you personally, your take on social media and sharing what you do and that whole act of, telling people, whether it's to inspire people, whether it's to draw people to support what you're doing. What are some of the things you've noticed that organizations are doing in your space? And then what is your kind of approach for sharing online?
Well, before we went live, I was sharing with you my strong aversion to social media. It's a means to an end, but I don't always know what the end is for me.
Right.
A few years ago, a colleague sort of workshopped with me the reason I use social media. She's like, I'm going to give you themes. And all of my themes were about putting out invitations. I love social media when I have an invitation to offer.
Right.
I love social media. I love social media when I have a question to ask. I love it when I get to hype up. I did a series, Women You Should Know, for a while, and people loved the series. It was just like me showcasing all these incredible women. it was just a selfie of me and another woman, and I would just describe in an off-bio way the humanity of that person and what they do in the world. I just don't, I think I was early adopter of social media. I was in university when Facebook went live. I think I joined Twitter in 2008, like I keep getting reminders all the time, that I should be celebrating some Twitterversary. And so, but I don't think I ever really built a meaningful relationship with it. I was looking for a post the other day to send to a friend from 2010 on Instagram. And I was going back to my early posts and I'd eat a dumpling. And it would be it was just a picture of a dumpling, no caption. It was some kind of avant-garde, but that was Instagram. No one really knew how to use it. And now there is this dominant way to use it and way not to use it. And it's a tool. And so I think there's analysis paralysis for me around social media. And like I said to you before, when I see other people doing great things, I'm so happy and I want to cheer them on. I just don't know how to do it in a way that feels right for me. So what you'll notice are boom and bust cycles, where I'm extremely active for exactly 3.5 weeks, and then I forget for 2 months that there is an online media universe. I don't know if that's the healthiest way to liaise with it, but it's the reality of how I liaise with it.
Makes sense. And I love that honesty and how you approach it, because it is different with everyone. And a lot of the organizations I speak to as well, their busiest people, their executive directors, are so focused on they can't do everything. So they're so focused on the things that are going to move the needle, the furthest, the quickest. And sometimes, yes, things like sharing the actual work becomes an afterthought.
Yeah.
And when you're in organizations that don't have a ton of infrastructure or resources to do that sharing for you and tell those stories, it kind of has to be pulled out of you, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity in showcasing impact in an ideal way. That's not just, hey, look at us, look what we did. But it's really about, how we're making an impact and how you can join. So I love what you said about, it does feel good to invite people to join, whether it's to attend an event or support a program or give their input, right? you're looking for facilitators, you're looking for, whatever it is, community feedback. I think that's your style, and that's what works for you.
And I should say that, Monumental has an Instagram presence,
right.
And it is run by our Monumental fellow, and she does a tremendous job of it. But, even she once a week sends a gentle, not gentle Slack note to me to be like, I need some information from you to make this alive. So it extends, right? You asked about organizations, that experience extends to our organizational belief system. And that's something I think both Kofi and I can say are trying to break, because we do see that for some of the people we're trying to reach, social media is such a strong and active and lively community that, I think this is the issue with brand is the identity of the co-founders becomes the identity of the organization. That's something we struggle with a lot. And we're really trying to manage that tension. And so part of that is just because we don't love social media, it doesn't mean Monumental has to be invisible online.
Exactly.
Right? We don't need to update our website or do all these different things. And I think, but to do it in a way that feels of us and of the community we're trying to build is tricky. It's
got to be authentic. But like you said, you can't ignore, the whole community that may be looking to work with you, and they're going to evaluate you based solely on that presence, 100%. For example. So yeah, I love that that's a balance. And I've spoken with a lot of people in nonprofit as well, that they know, like you said earlier, it's a means to an end. Sometimes new opportunities come from that content that you put out. Sometimes you could have an amazing 150-page report that people may never see unless it was broken down. Yeah, often.
Most of the time.
There's so many resources that sit on shelves, and even though they're just, they're listed on a website somewhere, where that content needs to be extracted, whether it's an infographic, whether it's a series of videos, whether it's someone explaining the report findings. And there's a lot of opportunity for that content in the social good space. So that's one of the reasons why, we have this show, right? Is to highlight those stories and to tell people, remind people to share their impact, right?
Well, and that just makes me think, and I'm going to walk out of here and immediately message Maliha, who works on our social media, because I think that's actually goes to the broader conversation, which is this kind of work where you're driving community-informed change that bridges a whole bunch of stakeholders and institutions, that is slow and complicated and about relationships and doesn't always have visibly tangible outcomes at any given moment.
Because it's always a work in progress.
Process. It's always a work in progress.
Right.
That sometimes social media can do some great storytelling to anchor moments, to celebrate successes, to make you feel like you're not in a vast ocean and you're still on the crossing, that you've reached a moment of respite. So as you're talking about that, it makes me think that it's actually for folks who do work that can be quite invisible, like some of what we do.
Right.
That it is it's mission critical to invite people in, to show them how change is getting made for us. It doesn't mean this is how change should be made. It means this is how we know to do it. It's an invitation.
Yep.
Right?
I love that. Yeah. And who knows, it could inspire someone to think of something totally different.
Yeah.
We have to wrap up for time, but I wanted to know if there was a resource, because I know you're an advocate of public libraries, you're an advocate, you've taught at OCAD, at U of T, and all over the place. So what are some go-to sources of inspiration or learnings or content that you'd recommend people check out?
Oh, there's so many good ones. I mean, on the work side, I think I use every opportunity to speak in a public domain to talk about Antoinette Carroll's work, equity-centered community design. I really think she has done a tremendous job of helping practitioners who are working in communities understand that there's some steps that you can take to ensure that you can get to a design process. Design process meaning anything. Could mean dialogue, could mean, mediation. It could mean all sorts of things when you're working in communities that are not communities that you're from. Right. So Antoinette Carroll's equity-centered community design framework, I would say Design Justice, which is an incredible book out of MIT Press, which, of course, is wonderful and continues, I think, to iterate, but it's a really nice grounding for the kind of work I do. I think it's important to also trade in the realm of joy and fiction and play and poetry. And so my reading list and my Goodreads is pretty diverse.
Very diverse, yeah.
The resources, I think my advice is, don't just explore resources in your space. The the most time I spend consuming anything outside of work is a chat cast by two comedians talking about inane things, but it rests me so that my imagination and my being can actually expand and have clarity around the things I want to do and how I want to be. So,
love that.
Yeah, it's hard to name one.
You keep your content consumption diverse.
Yeah.
But those are great books and kind of fundamentals in the areas in which you work.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is super helpful to share. So thanks so much for being on the show, Zahra. It's been amazing. I know you're very busy, so you got to get to your next thing. But yeah, thanks for being on Growth for Good.
I appreciate being invited. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode of Growth for Good. The show is presented by Daniel Does and produced by Creator Club in Toronto. You can find notes, links, and more about my guests at danieldoes.co, where you can also learn about ways we can collaborate. Feel free to connect with me anytime on LinkedIn or Twitter. If there is someone from the sector that you'd like to learn from or you'd like to be interviewed on the show, feel free to reach out to team@danieldoes.co. If you're considering creating a podcast or video series for your organization, connect with Creator Club at creatorclubstudios.com.